What does it really cost to be kind in a world full of deception and manipulation? Since time immemorial, virtue and compassion have been celebrated as the highest expressions of human nature. Yet, George Orwell reveals an uncomfortable truth. Kindness, when exercised without the rigor of critical thinking and the courage of conviction, can become a tool of submission and control. This literary and philosophical narrative invites us to explore the duality of an attitude that, at first glance, seems commendable but at times harbors deep and destabilizing risks. Orwellian narratives immerse us in dystopian worlds where truth is distorted and reality is subjected to the yoke of oppressive regimes. In these bleak atmospheres, naive virtue becomes the gateway to manipulation, as passivity and conformity turn into accomplices of a system that rewards blind obedience and punishes dissent. In totalitarian societies, unquestioning kindness transforms into a fatal weakness, where the absence of criticism and the lack of courage to confront injustices allow power to take hold and perpetuate itself. The purity of intentions, while a value many revere, can become the refuge of those who seek to avoid conflict at all costs. The idea of doing good is equated with blindly following a predetermined path, where reflective action is replaced by passive acceptance of imposed realities. This stance, far from protecting the individual, exposes them to manipulation by those who, in the name of supposed order, impose a single version of reality. The control of thought and the suppression of criticism are powerful weapons that reduce human beings to mere instruments serving a dominant ideology. Thus, kindness, if not accompanied by the ability to discern and the will to challenge, becomes an existential risk. Orwellian stories starkly illustrate how compassion can be exploited by unscrupulous leaders. The figure of the tireless, committed worker is reflected in characters who, despite their dedication, fall victim to abuse and exploitation. It is the story of those who, placing their faith in a system or authority figures, end up betrayed by the very benevolence that defines them. This double-edged nature of kindness, which appears to be a virtue but turns into a trap, evokes feelings of sadness and bewilderment in the face of an order that rewards submission. The narrative becomes even more striking when it reveals how passivity in the face of injustice equates to involuntary complicity with oppression. Silence and neutrality, which many associate with preserving peace, become a means of consenting to the unacceptable. Those who refuse to speak out of fear of losing stability or a desire to maintain an untarnished image, ultimately fuel a vicious cycle of abuse and repression. Power feeds precisely on this lack of resistance, on the absence of a critical spirit capable of questioning the status quo. In this sense, the apparent nobility of being a good person fades in the face of the price of inaction, exposing the real cost of submission. The author spares no detail in depicting the cruel face of authoritarian regimes, where independent thought is severely punished. Censorship and indoctrination arise as tools to eliminate any form of dissent, suppressing diversity of ideas in favor of an imposed consensus. In this context, being truly good entails far more than merely obeying a set of pre-established rules. It requires the courage to think autonomously and the determination to question even the most obvious truths. Intellectual rebellion thus becomes an act of survival, a struggle against an oppressive machine that thrives on conformity. This constant challenge to orthodoxy stands as a call to action, not to settle for the comfort of silence but to embrace the inherent risk of truth. Integrity and honesty, values that seemingly serve as antidotes to corruption, turn out to be double-edged swords in Orwell's universe. The determination to speak the truth, to maintain an honest stance in the face of reality, can have dire consequences in an environment where propaganda and manipulation are the norm. The figure of one who defends justice and truth is threatened by those who seek to conceal reality behind a veil of lies. In a world where falsehood is the means of control, upholding the truth becomes an act of defiance, a risk that may lead to persecution and isolation. The courage to be integral, to resist the temptations of conformity, comes at a high price, for it means challenging a system built upon the fragility of collective credulity. Each of these reflections leads us to a disturbing conclusion. Kindness, in its purest and most uncritical form, becomes a vulnerability in the hands of a power that does not hesitate to exploit naivety. Orwell's world becomes a mirror reflecting the paradox of human nature. The desire to be virtuous can ultimately become the very instrument that enables oppression. The lesson is clear and forceful. True goodness requires an active commitment, a constant struggle for truth, and resistance against authoritarian impositions. It is not about renouncing compassion or empathy but about combining them with the courage of reflection and the strength of conviction. Kindness without the ability to question becomes a trap, a kind of double-edged blade that, instead of protecting, exposes the individual to manipulation and subjugation. Orwell's vision is not merely a critique of oppressive political systems. It is also a call for individual introspection. He invites us to rethink our convictions, to examine whether our actions are guided by genuine will or if, on the contrary, we are merely carried along by the comfort of the familiar. The invitation is to discover that true strength lies in the ability to question and act accordingly, to transform passivity into a form of resistance that stands in defense of freedom. It is at this crossroads where the fate of the individual is decided, the intersection between complacency and a commitment to truth. The narrative carries an emotional weight that leaves no one indifferent. The betrayal of trust, the pain of witnessing how virtue can be corrupted by dark interests, awakens deep feelings of disappointment and anger. There is a palpable urgency to awaken, to break free from the lethargy imposed by a false morality that, instead of protecting, traps the individual in a prison of conformity. The intensity of these emotions becomes the driving force behind a reflection that transcends the pages of a literary work, turning into a timeless warning about the cost of indifference. Amidst this bleak landscape, the figure of the rebel rises as a symbol of hope and defiance. The individual who dares to question, who refuses to be a mere cog in an oppressive machine, embodies the essence of freedom. Their struggle is the manifestation of a humanity that refuses to be bent by the weight of power, that chooses truth even when it is uncomfortable and dangerous. This attitude, though risky, is what makes it possible to transform reality and carve out a future where justice prevails. The courage to be authentic, to not fear the consequences of speaking and acting in the name of truth, is revealed as the only path to building a society where goodness is combined with intelligence and critical thinking. Orwell's work, with its penetrating style and sharp insight into the mechanisms of power, challenges us to look beyond the surface. It calls us to a deep reflection on the role of morality in a context of manipulation and censorship. Every word, every scene, is imbued with a warning about the dangers of surrendering to the comfort of conformity. The internal struggle between what is perceived as right and what is truly necessary to resist becomes the central axis of a narrative that not only entertains but also moves and transforms the way we see the world. The story compels us to question the apparent innocence of everyday actions and forces us to recognize that, at times, being kind involves taking immense risks. It reveals that integrity, when translated into a tacit submission to the impositions of power, loses its meaning and becomes a weapon in the hands of the oppressor. The pursuit of truth and the defense of justice emerge as acts that demand sacrifice, courage, and, above all, the willingness to face the consequences of a reality that is not always kind. The reflection that arises is striking. Goodness is not a passive state but an active commitment that requires the fusion of compassion with critical thinking. In a world where manipulation and deception hide behind a facade of benevolence, the challenge is to transform the concept of goodness into a revolutionary force. It is about recognizing that true value lies in the ability to see beyond the obvious, to question imposed narratives, and to act accordingly, even if it means risking one's own safety. Orwell's lesson is that authenticity and the courage to speak the truth become fundamental acts of resistance in a society that claims to be just but, in reality, thrives on submission and conformity. This call to action resonates in every word and every scene, reminding us that freedom and justice can only be achieved if we are willing to challenge the structures of power. The Orwellian narrative, with its deep emotional weight and incisive analysis of the mechanisms of oppression, leaves an indelible mark on the reader. It invites us to rethink our own behaviors, to question the convenience of a goodness that lacks reflection, and to embrace the possibility of an active commitment to truth. The story shows us that, in an environment dominated by manipulation, being truly virtuous means being willing to face adversity, challenge the status quo, and transform uncertainty into an emancipatory force. The courage to uphold the truth, despite the consequences, stands as the fundamental pillar upon which a society that values integrity and critical thinking over complacency can be built. Throughout this journey, there is a palpable urgency to awaken from a slumber that appears to be a form of protection. The apparent security of being a good person is revealed as an illusion that, without the courage to question, becomes a latent risk. The price of truth and justice is high, and those who choose to face this challenge must be prepared to suffer the consequences of a system that does not tolerate dissent. However, it is precisely in this struggle that the seed of transformation is found, in the ability to turn fragility into strength and submission into a cry for freedom. This Orwellian perspective intertwines moments of deep introspection with sharp social criticism, evoking a spectrum of emotions that oscillate between despair and hope. The duality of human existence is reflected in every word, in every scene, reminding us that true greatness lies in the ability to face our fears and transform pain into a renewing force. The fight for truth and justice, though laden with sacrifice, emerges as the only path to escape the trap of conformity and achieve a full and authentic existence. The message derived from Orwell's vision is clear and challenging. Being truly virtuous is not a path of comfort or complacency but a journey filled with uncertainties and dangers. Goodness, when practiced without the support of critical thinking and the courage to question, becomes vulnerable to the machinations of those in power. The true essence of integrity lies in the ability to unite compassion with the firmness of an awakened mind, in the bravery to transform innocence into a tool for freedom, and in the determination to fight against the shadows that threaten to extinguish the light of truth. Every step toward authenticity demands a sacrifice, a renunciation of the security of the preordained and an openness to the possibility of being wounded by those who benefit from ignorance. However, it is in this surrender to truth that humanity's true power lies, the ability to reinvent itself, to transform adversity into opportunity, and to forge a path where justice and freedom become the true measures of being. The struggle for integrity thus becomes an emotional and existential journey that, despite its risks, holds the promise of an authentic and meaningful life. In conclusion, the reflection inspired by George Orwell's work calls upon us not to settle for a superficial goodness devoid of scrutiny. It challenges us to confront reality in all its complexity, to reject the comfort of submission, and to embrace the challenge of independent thinking. True greatness lies in the ability to transform risk into an opportunity for growth, to rebel against unjust impositions, and to build a future where integrity and honesty stand as the unshakable pillars of society. In a world filled with deception and manipulation, the courage to be authentic rises as the last stronghold of freedom, a reminder that goodness, when nourished by critical thought and commitment, becomes the unstoppable force that, even in the midst of darkness, can illuminate the path toward a more just and truthful tomorrow.